All right, and we're up and running on Facebook as well. So if you're just now joining us again, I want to welcome you one more time. We've got about 2 more minutes until we get started. In the meantime, we do love to hear from you. So feel free to jump in that chat box if you're joining us on Zoom and let us know where you're from. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can put in the comments where you are from. We do love to hear from you. Welcome, Monica from Laredo. So happy to have you here today. Welcome, Marissa from Houston. Glad you could join us. Welcome, Christy from Stephenville. And Jessica from Cooks in Fort Worth. So happy you could join us today. Welcome, Amy. From the Rice Center for Independent Living. So glad you could join us. Welcome, Alexis from Mineral Wells. All right, I do have 12:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What Should Be in My Child's IEP? My name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I am the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of Parent Training and Information Centers, or PTIs. PTIs are funded through the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. The 4 PTI projects in Texas are known as PACT, PATH, PIN, and TEAM. And our mission here at Partners Resource Network is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special healthcare needs. And also joining me today from Partners Resource Network is our Director of Statewide Services, Christina Henning, our support specialist, Chelsea Rivas, and our technology specialist, Zach Hidalgo. If you're having any technical difficulties, please be sure and reach out to Zach in the chat box and he can assist you. And for those of you who are needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for joining us in today's webinar. If you follow the link in the email, you can get your certificate of attendance. At the end of our webinar, we will have a time for question and answers. If you're joining us on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can type your questions in the comments. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. So let's get started. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Michelle Simmons. Dr. Simmons is the Lanahattan Professor of Learning Disabilities, the Director of the Center for Learning Disabilities at West Texas A&M University, and an Associate Professor of Special Education in the Department of Education. At West Texas A&M University, Dr. Simmons teaches undergraduate special education preparation courses and graduate educational diagnostic courses. Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. I am excited to be here with you all this afternoon. Let me get our... All right. So over this brief period of time, we are going to discuss what should be legally in your child's IEP, as well as how an IEP should be formatted, the best approach to developing an effective IEP, and then those specific components of an IEP, the PLAF, IEP goal, accommodations versus modifications, and the continuum of service provision. I do, just as Stephanie mentioned, encourage you to make note of any questions that you have, because I know that especially when it comes to IEP development and that ARD meeting and IEP planning meeting process, that many of you have had personal experiences or are anticipating those. And so if you have questions that are specific to experiences that you've had that are not addressed in the content, please do share those at the end of this time, because the intent here is to address the needs that you have as you have previously or anticipate developing IEPs over this next academic school year. So the IEP process, the development of an IEP, of course, is legally guided and should be or must be legally compliant. And so the foundation of that starts with those main laws that affect special education. And those are the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, many of these will be very familiar to you all. The Family and Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is FARPA, and then the Every Student Succeeds Act. And both the FARPA and ESSA are they apply to general education students, but as again, we all, and I'm sure y'all heard this before, you know, we view the special ed student as a general ed student first. And so of course there are implications for FARPA and ESSA for special education students. Then all three of those were federal law. And then within federal law, it's important to give consideration to the impact state and local laws and or policies and guidelines have on IEP development. And so this chart you see in front of you, I like to look at as a funnel. So when you begin to develop your child's IEP in collaboration with your school and IEP team, start broad and then narrow when considering legal criteria. So for example, what does federal law say? What does IDEA or FARPA say regarding the development of your child's IEP? Then we start filtering down or moving across this flow chart. So then what does state law say? And so of course for us that is Texas, and within Texas we are guided by the Commissioner of Education and State Board of Education rules, as well as Texas Administrative Code, and then Texas Education Code. And then within, down from state law, then we look at local or district policy. So what is my district policy? Does written policy exist in my district? Is there a special ed handbook or a student code of conduct? Where can I locate these documents? And if these aren't automatically given to you as part of introductory school procedures, ask, you know, does a special ed handbook exist? Can you please provide that to me? What is the student code of conduct? What are the expectations for my child's academic or behavioral performance as it relates to any handbooks that exist within the district for a general ed student? And so that should be where the guide starts. And then if once you do have access to these documents, and hopefully they're being automatically provided to you, but that's not always the case. And then honestly, in some districts, although a student code of conduct will always be standard, there's not always a special ed handbook depending on the size of your district. But once you have access to these, then begin examining and asking the questions, do these documents say anything about IEP development or delivery of educational services to students with special needs? And this chart is developed from the Texas Education Agency's side-by-side rules and regulations document, which you can find the link to that on this website. And I recommend saving that. You know, I always tell, especially our educational diagnosticians in training, these should be this should be bookmarked on their web browser. This is the place you go for any questions, this side-by-side document. And then in addition to the side-by-side rules and regulations within the state of Texas, it of course, and we're funneling back up now to federal law, it's important to be familiar with. And in fact, it is a legal requirement that your school district is giving you access to procedural safeguards and the guide to the ARD process. And so procedural safeguards should be given to you annually. Oftentimes, IEP meeting coordinators or special services coordinators will provide these at your child's annual IEP meeting, or sometimes they're given out, you know, at the start of an academic school year. And then the guide to the ARD process is legally required to be distributed when an initial evaluation occurs. However, you can always request any of these at any time for your reference. And once again, this is a tool that I recommend to evaluators that is, a bookmark to go to. In fact, it's a fantastic study tool for legal compliance and preparation for Texas Education Agency or State Board of Education certification for diagnosticians. So important documents there to earmark or note. So how should an IEP be formatted? What's the best approach to developing an effective IEP? Again, I always want to start with the law first, or the guiding principles in developing an IEP. And so here are 8 core principles of special education. The child find or zero reject rule, which states that school districts are required by law to seek out and identify every eligible student with a disability and determine if a disability does exist. And in doing so, a non-discriminatory evaluation should occur. And so that full initial individual evaluation should give consideration to, and I could do a whole separate discussion or presentation about the evaluation alone, but I'll focus our efforts on the IEP itself today. But that evaluation should always give consideration to any areas of weakness or struggle or suspected disability. Then we, of course, develop an IEP plan if a student, through the non-discriminatory evaluation, is found to be eligible under one of the 13 disability categories, as well as demonstrating an educational need for individualized services. And then through the development of that IEP, we are legally required to ensure FAPE, which is a free and appropriate public education, and delivery of that appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. There is legal guidance and requirement to give consideration to all services that might be needed in order to ensure that the child or student is performing successfully, both academically and functionally. You'll hear me emphasize that frequently, because both are critical and necessary. And so sometimes that evidences the need for related services in addition to instructional services. And then the process of developing an IEP, of course, should ensure parent participation and consent, or adult student participation and consent, depending upon the age of the student being served, and must ensure confidentiality. So I really like this flow chart for IEP development. The IEP, of course, is one of the most, it is the guiding document. It's the foundation and guide for a student with a disability if they are identified as meeting eligibility criteria and having a need for special education or individualized education services. And it should be viewed as a contract between the district and the student's guardians or the adult student. And so the role, if you are the whether your role is the parent or the evaluator or the general or special ed teacher, it's, sometimes time and availability of resources will impact our development of the IEP. And that is unfortunate, but it's really critical that we're giving careful consideration to this development of this document, of this plan, because it really is the roadmap and the lens through which we ask all the questions concerning a child's need in the education setting for a student with special services. And so I won't go into great detail on it because y'all have this PowerPoint for future reference. But these are just important components or guiding principles of developing an IEP. And you'll note in there, that we're, again, the shared responsibility and shared participation in the development, making sure that there is alignment to gen ed curriculum and standards and assessments. I see this frequently when we are preparing educational diagnostician students for certification exams. Oftentimes there's the misconception that, I'm developing an IEP goal, and then I'm correlating it back to the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. But the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, that Gen Ed curriculum, again, Gen Ed student first, should be what guides us. And then that should be helping drive our development of the IEP goals so that there's alignment, not a backwards up correlation. It should always, the plan, an IEP should always be individualized. That is the intent of IDEA, that we're planning on the individual needs of the student, not the system in which the student is being educated, nor the availability of resources within the system of which the child is being educated. And then we're always looking for measurement of progress and keeping in mind long-term goals, whether that be for early childhood, we're looking into elementary, middle school, you see, and then of course that ultimate adult learning outcome of graduation and launching for independent success. And here are the components of an IEP, and they are intentionally written in this order, starting top down, so that you'll hear me emphasize multiple times the importance of the order of the development of the IEP, because it is intended to be developed in a specific strategic way, with one item driving another, not working backwards or going at different parts or pieces at different times. And so an IEP should start with a PLAF, which is the statement of a student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, that it must include measurable annual goals. And these, there will always be academic goals, but again, there does need to be the presence of functional IEP goals if a student's functional performance in any way impacts their ability to be successful academically. And I think we can, and I'll talk more about this when we get deeper into goals, but I think we can all agree, typically for many of our students who have the need for special ed services, they also have a functional need in some capacity or another. Maybe that's socially, communication, transitions throughout the school day, behaviorally, but oftentimes academic and functional need just go hand in hand. And so be sure to be paying attention to that and asking about that. A behavior intervention plan is part of the IEP if needed. And again, we should be giving consideration to the need for a behavior intervention plan. That shouldn't be predetermined, right? There should at least be some sort of question or conversation during the IEP meeting that says, does the child have, are they able to follow the typical student code of conduct? Do they exhibit any additional needs outside of those classroom policies and management and guidelines that are being provided in order for them to be successful behaviorally? Then a statement of services to be provided, and this will be most familiar to you all as the schedule of services. So we've decided this is what they need. This is how we're going to deliver that. An explanation of the extent to which the student will participate or not participate in the gen ed classroom. So in addition to where the delivery of service is occurring, how that is going to happen. And then a statement of accommodations and participation in state and district-wide assessments. And you'll notice that is really far down in the flow chart of development. That doesn't start up here. And we're not having the conversation, oh, I think that this is what state assessment they're going to be participating in. And so as such, this is the goals we will be developing. The goal development occurred much further or much earlier in the discussion, ideally, best practice. And then finally, there must be an individual transition plan as in the state of Texas as early as, but no later than age 14. So again, just really emphasizing the critical importance of the order in which we develop the IEP. It legally is intended to be a systematic process that follows a specific order. And so with this, I like to use this illustration of building a house. So the foundation is your PLAF, that present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Then the framing are the goals and objectives. The roofing is the accommodations, modifications, and schedule of services. And then the windows and doors, that final step, you know, your brick, if you will, or paint, or that outside last touches, are participation in assessments. And so when we run it through this lens, this filter, you know, you can't put windows and doors in a house that has no foundation, meaning we can't make a decision about state assessments if we don't have a well-developed PLAF. Same concept with the roofing or the schedule of services. I can't start having the conversation of where my child is going to be taught if I haven't developed the framing, if I haven't developed a accurate, thorough, and comprehensive IEP goal and objective, and multiple goals and objectives potentially. So hopefully this has been a great tool for me as a diagnostician to run it through this lens, because when you sit down to the table with each other and you have all of these systemic factors influencing the conversation, as well as multiple perspectives as a result of the team at the table, which is the strength of IEP development, but also can allow IEP development to lose focus. I think it's just really important to keep this in mind. You know, we've got to have our PLAF goals, schedule of services, accommodations, modifications, then state assessment decisions, and we just can't move forward to the other without having really done well in establishing our foundation and framing and building that house. And so this puts it through, it's similar concept, just looking at it a different way. And I like this one in particular because the pyramid helps us give an idea even to potentially the amount of time we're spending having these conversations when developing the IEP during the meeting. Well, and I was about to, I'll stay the course right now and then address questions at the end. But, you know, well, I will say this. I know that due to availability of time, many of these processes have potentially occurred prior to your coming to the table, right? You know, that someone has already drafted a PLAF, someone has already drafted goals and objectives, and those are being just simply presented at the meeting. They're not being actively developed. But I would advise this, if these, and they most likely are being created prior to the meeting, you as the parent or adult student should be given a copy of the PLAF and proposed goals, objectives, and modifications at least 5 days prior to the IEP meeting. And then you should be given ample time during that meeting, or you could do so prior to actually review those and provide feedback. And they are a draft. They are not, it is not set, it is not established, and it is okay as a parent to speak up and have input and suggest changes to those goals or to the PLAF or to the, you know, suggest additional accommodations and modifications, because it, again, back to that shared responsibility, it should be a shared process where you and the student have plenty of time, both prior to and during the meeting, to provide input in the development of the IEP plan. So moving through each of those components, when I'm going to watch my time because I want to really allow for Q&A. But so what should be included in my child's PLAF statement? So here you can see, and I won't read through each one of these, but a good PLAF statement, you know, I should be able to read that and clearly know this is what the student can do. This is their areas of strengths. This is, well, let's start here. I should be able to see this is their area of eligibility. This is how that eligibility is impacting their performance in this particular subject area or functional performance area. This is their strengths, this is what they can do, and this is their weaknesses, this is what they cannot do. And it's clear that what they are having trouble with is going to lead to or provide cues for writing the accompanying annual goal. And so here's an example of a PLAF, a well-written PLAF for a second grade student in the area of math. And so we can clearly see here, okay, here's what Herbie can do. Here is what he's struggling with. And so that would help guide me towards, okay, because this is an area where we're struggling, this is where we're likely going to draft an IEP goal. Then what should the IEP goal look like? What components must and should be included in the IEP goal? So first, annual goals are statements that describe what a student can reasonably be expected to accomplish within a 12-month period. I do want to talk about that 12-month. Goals should not be recurring consecutive academic years. We should be revisiting and evaluating those based on documented progress and determining if they are appropriate. And if the student hasn't been reasonably able to accomplish the goal within the academic school year or within the annual calendar year, then the goal should be changed or discontinued, dismissed, revised, right? Because it needs to be an accurate reflection of what is attainable or achievable for the child within the calendar year of review. And the purpose of annual goals are to identify areas in which a student needs that specialized or individually designed instruction, right? Because goals are what set apart special education services from 504 services or response to intervention or a student support team model. And so they should be very individualized and tailored to the needs of the student based on that well-written class. So here are the 4 critical components of a measurable IEP goal. They all should be characterized by a time frame, condition, behavior, and criterion. So time frame is the amount of time in which the goal is going to be accomplished. Again, those should be within a reasonable amount of time for measurement. So general best practice recommendation, I wouldn't let those lapse over the duration of an academic school year or a full annual calendar year. If, for example, your child, let's say you're going to have an annual IEP meeting coming up in October, then our goal should be by next October, we've exhibited successful performance based on the criterion that's written for the written goal. And if there hasn't been successful performance, then the goal likely needs to be dismissed or significantly revised. Conditions are the resources or tools that are going to be provided in order to help assist the student in reaching the goal. So that might be like, Tim given instructional cues, or Tim given a flow chart or a graphic organizer, or Tim given one-on-one assistance. It's the condition that the child needs in order to be successful with the goal. And then the behavior says, this is what they are going to do. And most critical to this behavior piece is it must be observable. So that means that, if I'm a parent and the diagnostician has sent me draft IEP goals, getting ready for my child's upcoming meeting, I'm going to read that IEP goal and then ask myself on this behavior piece, if I walked into the classroom right now, would I be able to measure the behavior that this goal says my child should be doing, right? It should be that clear to anyone, even someone who hasn't had much educational training or experience themselves. It should be something that we can easily observe or measure, thus leading to measuring progress of the child if they're making adequate progress towards the determined goal. And then speaking of adequate progress, that critical piece is the criterion or criteria. So how are we going to know if they've successfully achieved or met the short-term objectives and overall goal? And so there should be some measurable way, whether it's a duration of time or how many tries or a percentage or a rate in which items are correct or the frequency within it occurs. It should be easily measurable, easily observed, easily measured, and we know clearly what criteria we're going for when the goal is measured. And so here is a few examples of some measurable IEP goals. I'll just look at this first one real quick for the sake of time, but here you can see it has all the components. Here's the time frame in 36 instructional weeks. Here's the condition. We're going to give Joseph a 3rd grade passage and he's going to use decoding skills and oral practice. So he's going to have the opportunity to practice. Here's the student, and here is what he's going to clearly do: read 70 words per minute. So the behavior, we know exactly what it is. And then how, the measure for success, he's going to, if I were doing a reading running record, he's going to have less than 10 errors in that 70 words per minute that he reads. And so it has all the components, and it's easily observable, measurable, and we know what our criterion for success is. Here are some great resources for writing IEPs. Of course, we have some of them here that are a part of the PIN project here, the network that you all are using as a resource. And then the IRIS Center has some great tools and modules that you can go through on IEP goal writing. And then understood.org also provides some good guidance. I like them as a tool or resource. And so accommodations versus modifications. And I'm working through this material in the presentation in the same way that we would be working through the IEP development at an IEP meeting. We started at PLAF, we started at that foundation. Then we went to development of IEP goals. We put up the framing, and now we're working on the roofing with accommodations versus modifications. And so what are accommodations? They do not change the actual TEKS or text. They change the material or presentation. They ensure access. Accommodations ensure access, and they could be delivered to anyone, both gen ed, special ed, 504, response to intervention, student support team. Any student can benefit from an accommodation and receive the support of an accommodation. Then modifications do change the instruction, or they change the curriculum. And sometimes this gets difficult to distinguish because let's say, we're going to reduce the number of test questions on a test. Well, sometimes that is an accommodation if the quantity of reduction is minimal, right? Maybe there's only 2 or 3 questions, or let's put it this way, there's a 10-question test and the child is only omitting 2. But if the number of questions omitted significantly alters the overall exam, let's say they're doing 50% of the exam instead of, the entire exam, then that would move us over the modification category because it's significantly altered how we assessed the content. And so I'm pretty visual, and so this really helps me just keep in mind the two. This is a model of what we would call an accommodation, right? So the height of the water fountains are all different. So we're ensuring access, but what comes out of the fountain is the same. The content being taught is the same. Everybody's getting water. This would be an example of a modification because, what the student is receiving, the actual content material, the soda is different. So again, hopefully that helps you see that. And then finally, again, moving down that hierarchy, we've talked PLAF, we've talked goals and objectives. Now we've decided accommodations versus modifications. And now that we've got that whole individualized package developed, now we're going to decide, where does this occur? Where are we going to educate the student? How are we going to educate the student? Who's going to help with those delivery of services? And so this is just a continuum of schedule of services where down here is the least restrictive, the most restrictive environment, and here would be most inclusive. And over here you can see on number of students, or they're using the term pupils here, but again, it moves up that direction. And so, oh, good, I've allowed time because I can't help but noticing that, we've had the numbers keep going up in the bubbles in the chat and Q&A. And so I'm eager to help answer some of your questions. But I do really like this quote from Rick Lavoie, and it's where I would like to conclude prior to answering questions. But special education is an art and a science. And that is just so true because we're using data in order to develop informed decisions while balancing the individual and unique needs of the child and student, which brings that art piece. So, I always view this as science is the data side of it, but art is just the very nuanced and specialized, unique and individualized needs of the child. And each child works at their own pace and competes only against their own performance. So measuring individualized progress, not compared progress. So I'm going to pause there and invite any questions that you might have.
All right, we do have some questions. As a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box so they don't get lost in the chat. The chat's very active. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can put those in the comment section. We have a question. What accommodations or modifications are allowed on a STAR test?
And so I'm actually, when it's specific to state testing, I am going to direct you to the Texas Education Agency's website as the best resource for that. And so, and it's simple. Maybe I can throw it in the chat box here for you all. Let me try to find that. But if you even simply Google TEA STAR accommodations, and that'll help direct you to the appropriate resource. But the Texas Education Agency's state website is going to be your best resource for state assessment accommodations.
Absolutely. All right. See, trying to get through all of our questions that we've got. Okay, and the question, if there is an update to a goal or an accommodation during the current IEP, can they update other goals or accommodations as well?
Yes, and that's a great question. I didn't talk specifically timelines, but the expectation for timelines for both IEP development and individual evaluations. An individual evaluation must occur at least every 3 calendar years within a 3-year time frame, and that must include updated new data. I know many of you have probably experienced a review of existing evaluation data, and that is okay if the student hasn't exhibited any significant changes or needs educationally, but even those reads should have new data in them. It shouldn't just be a repeat of the FIE that you saw 3 years ago. And so then, speaking specifically to IEP goal revision and an IEP planning meeting, one of those should be occurring at least once every academic calendar year, but most certainly could occur more frequently if the need exists. So like in the case of your question, if you note that, this IEP goal just really is not appropriate, or as I'm receiving IEP goal updates, progress reports at home, we're really not making progress to the goal, then most certainly request that IEP meeting. And, as a diagnostician, I know that your diagnostician is probably not going to be wild about that because they're working through what's a very busy calendar year. But again, best practice and child-centered student planning, we would hold a meeting to review IEP goals. And that doesn't just have to be one. It can be every goal that's in place for the child to determine that they're appropriate. Because what ends up happening, like let's say, I have a student who had their IEP meeting in the fall and things were going really well. And we thought, so we weren't paying really close attention to the IEP goals and objectives. Well, then, spring semester gets difficult, child's starting to feel pretty anxious because state assessment's on the horizon, and we start seeing behavior problems. And I think that my child might have a need for extra behavioral support. Well, as the evaluator, I'm going to filter that conversation through the existing IEP goals and objectives. And I might say, well, because they have this IEP goal, they really don't have a need for extra behavior support. Well, that just emphasizes the importance of that development of an IEP goal, right? We need to make sure that the IEP goal that was initially developed was appropriate, because how can I say I don't need this related service or we don't need behavior support when the actual goal that we created wasn't really a very good goal in the beginning?
So we've got a few people asking same or very similar question. What should a parent do if they believe the school is not following their child's IEP?
Okay, so I always start that term shared responsibility. Ideally, you have a positive relationship with someone at the school. Hopefully it's, a class homeroom teacher or a special ed case manager, and there's some sort of history or pattern of ongoing communication. And so hopefully that at foundation, that relationship exists. There's someone that you have a positive relationship with, have good communication with, that you can just have that conversation, reach out to them by email or phone call or Parent Square or, whatever the app is that your school uses for communication, and say, hey, I have concerns about my child's IEP. I don't think it's appropriate, and I want to meet with you and talk to you about this. Now, if you don't have an existing relationship with someone at your school, then it's okay to take that concern to a diagnostician, a campus principal or administrator. And I try to use the chain of command, where I'm starting with the classroom teacher and working up from there. But I'm also balancing that with it, the parent is the voice for the child, right? And you want to ensure that their needs are met. And so it is most certainly okay to reach out to an administrator if necessary in order to ensure that that IEP is appropriate and accurately developed.
Okay, so a question, could a student, could they have a 504 meeting as they're waiting for an evaluation to be completed for a student, to get some accommodations or some support in the meantime?
Yes, absolutely. And so the reason I hesitated on the answer there, because absolutely. And to that end, just like I said, we could be providing accommodations to a gen ed student that helps them be successful. Most certainly, if there is an existing referral going on or existing evaluation being conducted, because again, our overall goal in general education and most certainly in special education is the success of the student, right? And so you absolutely could have a 504 meeting and then be receiving 504 services until the evaluation is complete. Just want to be careful on that from the perspective of student-centered decision-making and best practice. We don't want the 504 services to be something that occurs in lieu of the individualized evaluation, especially if the evaluation indicates that the student does end up having a need for special ed services. So yes, you can use 504 in the meantime, but don't want that to deter the ultimate delivery of education, specialized services, if that's what the student has a need for.
Trying to get through questions. So does a parent have the right to suggest accommodations and modifications? And do they have the right to say no if they don't feel comfortable with the accommodations or modifications the school is recommending?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that, of all that, you have the right to suggest changes to the PLAF. You have the right to suggest changes to the IEP goals and short-term objectives, and most certainly to the accommodations and modifications. And this is where I also really like the concept of student-led IEP meetings. I don't know if this is a term that is familiar to you all, but at one point I worked at a district in the Metroplex area where it looks like many of you are from. And they started very early on with the concept of student-led IEP meetings. And so as early, if the parent was comfortable, and that's also a shared decision with campus staff, but if the parent was comfortable, as early as kindergarten, the child would come to the IEP meeting, and perhaps they were only attending during introductions and, you know, saying who they were. But as the child aged and progressed, let's say potentially by late elementary or middle school, the child was attending the meeting and oftentimes in charge of the meeting agenda. And so at this place, accommodations and modifications, the student had a very strong voice and a lot of input on what accommodations and modifications they preferred and which one of those worked for them, so that you didn't run into the case that you've got, you know, all these accommodations that the child themselves does not benefit from or feel comfortable using.
All right, so a couple of people have asked, is there a maximum or set number of goals that are included in an IEP? And then what subject matters should be included in IEP goals?
So there's not a set number. Again, this is going to vary from student to student based on individualized need. However, this is where data plays such an important role. There should be enough data gathered prior to developing the IEPs in order to make an informed decision regarding what subject areas or what areas of functional performance that the student needs IEP goals. And so what does that data look like, right? Where are we getting that data from? Well, one of those should be the evaluation. And so that once again emphasizes the importance of a current evaluation, but then data also comes in both formal and informal ways. And so let's take, for example, like if I were preparing for an IEP meeting for a third grade student, you know, I would pull up as their evaluator or special ed case manager, I would pull up their most recent evaluation. Then I would be asking for parental input from you. I would be asking for teacher input from all of their teachers. I would be looking at, well, they wouldn't, third grade, they wouldn't have state-based assessment yet, but I would be looking at district common assessments, curriculum-based measurements, any work samples. You know, there should be this comprehensive collection of information that then guides us that we can look at, okay, this is the expectation for performance in third grade math, and I can see that my student is having trouble in these areas. Thus, there needs to be an IEP goal, because based on, you know, their weaknesses and the data that I have, they're not going to be able to meet the general ed expectation for performance in this particular area for third grade math. Therefore, they need an individualized goal for them to reach. And maybe, you know, like I'm thinking of a student with a specific learning disability in the area of, let's say, basic reading that's also impacting math problem solving. Well, it is likely if they, and this is not always the case, but it's likely if there's a deficit in basic reading, it is going to impact performance in ELAR, math, science, and social studies. And so there potentially is a measurable goal in all of those subject areas, and potentially more than one goal in all of those subject areas. Now, you want an IEP to be attainable and measurable, so you don't want so many goals that we can't manage and monitor progress on it throughout the full academic calendar year. But you do want there to be the presence of enough goals that we're addressing those areas of deficits or need.
Okay, we've got a few questions related to evaluations. And so one is asking who would complete an evaluation for a student that is school aged. So maybe go over the process of requesting an evaluation. But then also a question, could you ask for an evaluation for behaviors that you see at home?
So the first question on who completes the evaluation, that is completed by a team. Typically, the request for an evaluation or concern, that an evaluation needs to be done happens with the campus diagnostician, or if I don't recall if you said, Stephanie, if this was elementary aged, but if so, that might, okay, then sometimes that commonly happens, you express concern to the homeroom or the class teacher, your homeroom teacher, or the campus counselor, or your assistant principal. Those are common because sometimes the diagnostician won't be campus-based. They might be traveling between multiple campuses. But you just let them know. And currently, due to recent legislation over the past several years, most likely as a parent, if you say, I'm concerned and I think that my child might have a learning difficulty or a learning difference, I'd like them to be evaluated, likely they're going to move forward with the evaluation, or at the very least, meet with you to address those concerns. Can you remind me the other, I'm sorry, I got lost in my.
No problem. Can you request an evaluation for behaviors that are seen in the home?
Yes, so that actually kind of depends on from what context you're coming. So if you are the parent of a child who already receives special education services, then you would want to bring this up because, again, what it's all going to tie back to from the lens of evaluation is what impact is the child's behavior, both in the school setting and home setting, what impact is that having on their academic performance, their educational performance? And so if behaviors at home are significant enough, or you're having enough difficulty that it's impacting the child's ability to perform successfully academically in the school setting, then yes, there might be a need for in-home support or in-home training. Now, if you are not receiving special education services in the school setting yet, right? Like if you're just asking about behaviors you're seeing at home, then the starting place for that conversation would be to approach the teacher and say, hey, I'm seeing these behaviors at home. Are you also seeing these behaviors in the school context? Because IDEA, that law, is written for the purpose of success in the school or education setting. Now, to me, home and school go hand in hand, but the first place that is going to be looked at is at the school setting.
So I've got several questions asking about goals for elective classes, art, PE, music, things like that, and what data you would look for. So maybe address looking at the data in the present levels and how that correlates to goals for electives.
Exactly. And so Stephanie's already alluded to what you would be looking at. So one of it, and we go back to the TEKS, the text can be our guide, and that text exists in elective courses. So let's say, in art, there's a TEK that a child is going to be expected to that is going to be an area of instruction for that academic school year, like say 5th grade art. And the TEK is very specific to, it's very language or reading heavy, right? The demand for reading and reading comprehension is going to be high for whatever this particular TEK in art is. And we can tell from the path, well, my child has a weakness in reading comprehension and basic reading. Then we would say, well, that, because of the 5th grade art TEK, and sorry, I'm not really familiar with art, so this may be a poor example, but because of the 5th grade art TEK that demands skills in reading comprehension, and because my child the PLAF says, we've got a deficit in reading comprehension, then yes, I do need an individualized goal that shows how my child's going to perform in this particular TEK area, since they're not going to be able to do that at grade level as expected for that particular area. So the short answer is yes, it could be appropriate that there are annual goals in elective areas. And some of those, especially for students who have deficits in a bit adaptive behavior, you know, or they have significant social needs. Maybe you have a student with autism, or they have significant behavior needs. You have a student with an emotional behavioral disorder, then there likely is a need for a functional goal that is applicable, you know, to multiple subject areas, including the elective course.
All right, a minute ago, you mentioned in-home training, and we've had a couple of parents ask, what is in-home training?
Okay, so in-home training, and I shouldn't, but I tossed it in the bucket with, you know, to me, probably because of going through the IEP process, it falls in that category when we're giving consideration to transition services and transportation and related services, which might include, you know, music therapy or art therapy or extended school year services. So in-home training, if there is an established significant functional need, typically, that is where the school provides support and services within the home setting. And, you know, in my past experience, I've seen that most commonly delivered to students whose eligibility category or disability area is in the areas of autism, emotional behavioral disturbance. Perhaps there's a orthopedic impairment or a traumatic brain injury where there's a physical need for in-home support. Hopefully that answered that for.
All right, so I have a parent that said that they've been told that their child needs to show a lack of progress for a minimum of 6 weeks in order to kind of revise or change up any goals or accommodations. So could you speak to when to maybe speak to the school about making some changes if things aren't working?
Right. And I can see the school's perspective for that recommendation because, you know, there's a hesitation to make changes if there hasn't been adequate time to measure progress. But then at the same time, we do want to make sure that if the student is not making progress, that we're addressing that within a timely manner. You know, that shouldn't be used as a way to deter from revisions. And so that might be a place, again, back to the district policy on that flow chart where you can actually know, well, is there, does the district have special education policies or a special ed handbook that speaks to guidance and procedures regarding adequate progress and time frame for adequate progress? But, you know, you do want to continue to be a strong voice and advocate in that way, because you don't want to look up and, you know, the whole semester has passed and your student hasn't made progress, but the school has continued to give you a placeholder on, well, we don't look at this until this certain points. Because I think my fear in your question in terms of school perspective is that the whole idea of this is the blanket rule, right? Because again, the intent, IDEA's intent for special ed services is individualized. And so we should be individually evaluating the need the student has outside of some blanket policy, if you will.
Okay, I think this will be our final question in the interest of time. So this parent has a child that is in high school, a freshman in high school, and they're kind of trying to figure out the balance between tutoring and doing extra like tutoring and things like that to support their student versus looking at accommodations or potential modifications. Like, where's the balance between how much tutoring should the student have versus when do we go into accommodations or looking into modifications for the student?
Oh, and you know, I really like this question because it brings me to some report writing skills that I work on with graduate educational diagnostic students. So when I when students are learning to write reports as a diagnostician prior to working within the school system, before there's a computer program that kind of starts to dictate the format of that, I always have students make recommendations in 3 different ways on their reports. The first would be to the environmental setting, like, does this student need any changes in their education setting or environment? Then the next one is the accommodation piece that you're talking about. Does this student need any specific instructional accommodations to ensure that they get access? And then the third area is to the actual instructional content, which is the piece that you're at. So to me, you're asking about 2 different things, because tutoring actually provides additional instruction, whereas accommodations ensure that we're doing something extra to ensure access to instruction. So it may be, without knowing exact details of the case of the student, it may be that there is a need for both, right? This makes me think of, like, with our students with dyslexia, it's not enough to say, oh, they need these accommodations, right? We know, based on a lot of research and the guidance provided by the dyslexia handbook, that in addition to the accommodations, they need a targeted instructional program that helps remediate, that does something beyond what they're receiving in the classroom. So, it might, so I guess that's a, kind of a preference based on your experience as the parent, and especially the preferences of your child since they're a high school student. If the academic tutoring is starting to affect participation in preferred extracurricular activities. So, sorry, I don't know that I helped with answering that a whole lot without the background information, but I would take that from the approach, what is the tutoring doing to help teach outside of what they're regularly receiving in the classroom? And are there extra things they're doing in the tutoring that are helping them be successful, that maybe, yes, you do want to add the accommodation, but it seems like 2 separate things going on there, accommodations and helping with something in addition to regular classroom instruction.
Absolutely. So thank you. Our time is up for today. I know we had so many questions between Facebook and Zoom. It was hard to get to all of them. And so if your question wasn't answered, know that you can reach out and ask us those questions anytime. But let's wrap up in the interest of time. So again, Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wealth of information. I particularly love how you make it so accessible, talking about building the IEP like building a house and having to build on each thing. And so thank you for that. That's a great mental image that we can take with us. And so as a reminder, we have a recording available for the webinar. It will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. And for those of you that are needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for attending today's webinar. Follow the link in that email and you can get your certificate of attendance. As we continue our Knowledge is Power series, we've got a lot of wonderful collaborators that are joining us, and we are so grateful to have them all as a part of this process. Our next webinar coming up is going to be on October 1st, and it is Smart Transitions, Leveraging Assistive Technology for Success, with Dr. Sean Smith from the University of Kansas. He's also president of the National Down Syndrome Congress. On October 22nd, we are going to have What's Function Got to Do with It? Behavior and its Impact on Your Child's Education, with Dr. Laura Kern, Associate Research Professor of the University of South Florida and the Florida Center for Inclusive Communities. And then on October 29th, we've got Let's Chat, Communication Strategies Are Key, with Dr. Morgan Foster, Texas A&M University AgriLife Extension Services, and the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities. But we're going to wrap up our Knowledge is Power series on November 12th with Resolving Conflicts Constructively, Informed Parents Make Informed Choices, with Dr. Timothy Hedin, Cadre Senior Consultants. On the screen now is contact information for our Director of Statewide Services, Christina, our support specialist, Chelsea, and myself. Please check out our website again at prntexas.org for information on upcoming webinars and events in your regions, as well as lots of information for parents. You can follow us on Facebook and X at PRN Texas. Thank you again for joining us. Dr. Simmons, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share your wealth of information. And I'm looking forward to your lecture coming up at WT here in a couple of weeks.
Yes, thank y'all so much. It's always a pleasure to join you.
All right, and stop sharing. We're going to end now. Thank you again for joining us. And Dr. Simmons, thank you.